With my arm broken I could scarcely eat, and my daughter said, "He warned you tonight." It began with a smell long before the voices, with a heavy sweetness of roasted duck and baked apples crawling along the ceiling and settling over the table like a low cloud. It should have been a comforting smell, the kind people associate with holidays and family warmth, but for Alice Ashworth it was nothing but a taunt. She sat at the head of the long table in her own dining room, an empty plate set before her, the gold rim glinting under the chandelier. Her right arm rested on her lap in a thick plaster cast from knuckles to elbow, dead weight and dull ache, a reminder of bones that had failed to withstand one brutal moment. Her fingers, mottled and swollen at the edge of the cast, twitched uselessly whenever she thought about reaching for the serving dish. On her left side, the hand that was still free lay in her lap, obedient but clumsy, too far from the heavy platter of duck in the middle of the polished table. Around her, cutlery chimed and glassware clicked as the others ate. No one offered to serve her. No one reached for her plate. Hit that subscribe button and tap the bell icon so you never miss our latest uploads. Marcus filled the space her late husband used to occupy, slouched in the high-backed chair at the far end of the table as though it had been carved for him. The velvet upholstery, once her husband's throne during birthdays and anniversaries, now bore the weight of the man who had broken her arm. His jacket, a shade somewhere between wet pavement and old charcoal, was already open, his shirt strained over a soft belly. Grease shone at the corners of his mouth as he tore chunks of meat from his plate, chewing loudly, washing it down with sharp gulps of vodka. Around him sat 3 guests from his department, 2 men and a woman, all younger, all careful. They ate with their shoulders drawn in, their eyes fixed on their plates, pretending not to notice the old woman with an empty dish and a useless arm at the head of the table. "Help yourselves," Marcus boomed, his voice ricocheting off the ceiling, too loud for the size of the room. "Don't be shy. Sierra outdid herself today." His words dripped with fake generosity, the sort that demanded gratitude he hadn't earned. Sierra sat at his left, her beige dress dulling her usually warm skin tone, making her look washed out and tired. She cut a cucumber into precise slices, one after another, her gaze carefully avoiding her mother's face. Once as a child, she had run through this same room in bright colors, socks sliding on the floor, ponytails bouncing. Now she sat with her back stiff, knife steady, pretending not to hear the way her mother's stomach clenched and growled in the quiet between Marcus's jokes. One of the guests, the youngest man with glasses and nervous shoulders, glanced up for a moment. His name was Sam. Alice had heard it earlier, when Marcus introduced them like trophies. Sam cleared his throat. "Maybe we should serve Dr. Ashworth," he murmured, just loud enough to be heard. Marcus didn't even look up from his plate. "Stay out of it, Sam," he said lazily, sloshing more vodka into his glass. The bottle knocked against the rim with a sharp clink. "Our dear doctor is on a special diet today. Therapeutic fasting. Clears the mind. Isn't that right, Mama?" He finally turned his head, fixing her with a bleary, victorious smile. In his eyes there was no hint of regret for what he'd done the previous night. Only satisfaction, the malignant pride of someone convinced he had successfully put an old rival in her place. He enjoyed this, her silence, her hunger, her immobility. Sierra's voice slipped into the space like a nervous shadow. "Mama knows she has to be careful at her age," she said quietly, still not meeting Alice's gaze. "She shouldn't be climbing on chairs and reaching up to high shelves anymore." For 30 years, Alice had spent her life inside operating rooms, bent over open skulls while machines hummed and monitors beeped. She had watched thoughts flicker as electrical waves, watched memories vanish under tumors, watched fear live in specific folds of gray matter. She knew what panic did to a person. She knew what denial looked like. What she didn't know, and could no longer trace in her own mind, was the moment when the girl she had raised turned into the frightened echo of the man now sitting where her husband once sat. The clock in the corner marked the seconds with precise metallic clicks. It had belonged to her father, a German grandfather clock that had never gained or lost a minute in all the years she'd owned it. Its pendulum swung with a steady, uninterested rhythm, measuring out her humiliation in sound. Each beat sent a new wave of throbbing pain through her arm, a dull echo rising from the fracture deep in the bone. She'd known it was bad the instant it happened. That sharp, dry sound, somewhere between a stick snapping and ice cracking, had told her more than the X-ray later would. Displaced fracture of the radius, midshaft. A break you got when force met bone in one single, focused blow. The assistant director of housing raised his glass. To discipline, Marcus announced. Every home needs order. Someone pays the bills, someone makes the rules. Those living off other people's kindness should sit quietly and avoid drama. He threw the drink back in one gulp, set the glass down with unnecessary force, and skewered a pickled mushroom with his fork. Alice watched him. Inside, something that had been raw and hurting all day cooled and hardened. It was a sensation she recognized from the old days. The cold clarity before a risky operation. The minute when emotion drained away and only procedure remained. She had felt it in the scrub room, when the anesthesiologist nodded and life shifted into her hands. It came now, not under the white glare of surgical lamps, but under the warm light of a chandelier. She sat up as straight as the pain allowed. Her spine remembered how to hold itself, how to draw dignity out of habit. "Marcus," she said softly. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It sliced through his laughter, cut straight through the clinking of glasses and the nervous scraping of cutlery. Marcus's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. The woman from his department froze with her napkin in her hand. Sam held his breath. "What do you want?" Marcus muttered, not yet turning around. His tone carried the boredom of a man indulging an elderly relative. "Need more water? Another napkin?" He smirked toward the guests. "Careful, everyone, the general is about to issue orders. We're all very intimidated." "You're sitting in my husband's chair," Alice said. Her eyes stayed on him, steady, unblinking. "And by my count, you have 1 minute left to enjoy it." The words were not loud. They did not sound like a threat, more like a statement of fact. Still Marcus turned, confusion creasing his forehead. "What did you say?" he asked. There was a jagged edge beneath the laziness now. "Is that supposed to scare me, Alice? Are you going to swing that plaster club at my head?" He barked out a laugh, too high and too long. "Go on, count it down. 59. 58. She didn't answer. Her attention shifted to the face of the clock, to the thin second hand making its relentless journey around the dial. It trembled slightly as it moved, a tiny quiver at each tick. She watched it climb, circle, creep toward the top. She had set certain mechanisms in motion 24 hours earlier. They did not run on Marcus's schedule. They ran on hers. The aroma of duck blurred, and for a moment the room dissolved. Time slipped. She was back in the hallway of the night before, back on the hardwood floor with her arm on fire and Marcus's shouting echoing through the walls. Began the previous evening, when the condo had smelled not of food, but of spilled liquor and stale fear. The lights in the living room had been dimmed. Bottles and crumpled receipts littered the coffee table. Marcus paced between the sagging sofa and the window, stumbling every few steps, his movements jerky and unpredictable. He looked less like a grown man and more like an animal that had found itself trapped in a shrinking cage. "I need the money," he had snarled, his voice rising and breaking. "You don't understand the kind of hole I'm in, old woman. This isn't late rent or a parking ticket. These are people who don't send reminders. They send knives." Spit left his mouth on the last word and landed on the polished floorboards between them. Alice stood in the doorway to her bedroom, her hand on the frame as if she were physically holding back his advance. "This apartment was bought by my husband," she replied, steady and firm. "It is the only corner of the world he left me. I will not sign it away so you can patch the holes you drilled into your own life." She had miscalculated. Not the answer. She could not have answered differently and still recognized herself, but the person she was facing. For years she had treated Marcus as frustrating, weak, greedy. A parasite perhaps, but still within the bounds of ordinary human flaw. That night, it became painfully clear that something inside him had shifted, that fear for his own skin had burned away whatever old decency remained. He came at her with a speed she wouldn't have expected from his heavy frame. His face twisted, unfamiliar. There was nothing left of the polite man who sent flowery texts on Mother's Day. His pupils were blown, his breath sour. He slammed into her full force. Later, he would call it a push. Alice's body, lighter now than it had been in her working years, lifted off the floor for a split second. Her right arm flew up against the doorframe in instinct, not logic. She didn't think about fracture patterns, about leverage, about what bones could withstand. She simply moved to protect her head. The impact shot through her wrist and into the radius, and the world erupted into a single bright point of pain. The sound followed, a dry, snapping crack that she recognized with grim professional certainty even through the agony. She slid down the frame to the floor, curling around her arm protectively. Cold sweat broke across her forehead. Her vision pulsed, dark at the edges, as if someone were turning down the dimmer switch on the room. Sierra stood a few feet away, one hand over her mouth, the other clutching the back of a chair. Her eyes were wide, horrified, but they did not dart to the phone. They did not move toward her mother. "Why do you insist on provoking him, Mama?" Sierra whispered in that moment, somewhere between fear and reproach. "Just sign the papers. It's easier that way." Marcus leaned over Alice, his shadow falling over her like a curtain. "You see what you've done," he hissed. "You can barely walk and you try to climb up on chairs. You tripped over your own feet. That's all anyone needs to know, understand." His tone shifted into something slick and calculated. He snatched the landline off its cradle and yanked the cord from the wall with a vicious jerk. Then his hand dove into the pocket of her housecoat and fished out her phone. "No calls. No police. You sit here and reconsider your attitude." He slammed the bedroom door and turned the lock. Footsteps stormed away. A cabinet door banged somewhere. A bottle rattled. Voices from the television burst and faded. Outside, city traffic continued its indifferent roar far below the windows. Inside, there was only the sound of Alice's ragged breathing and the throb in her arm, hot and nauseating. Panic tried to claw its way up her throat, frantic thoughts racing. Hospital, ambulance, neighbors. She tamped it down with the same ruthless discipline she had used in operating rooms when monitors shrieked and lines fell flat. Panic shuts down hands, she reminds herself. And she still needed her one good hand. She forced herself to move. Every shift of her body sent a new spark of pain down her arm, but she inched toward the old linen cabinet against the wall, dragging herself along with her left hand and her heels. She had always kept certain things there. Old habits never quite left a surgeon, no matter how long ago retirement was signed. Her fingers found the handle of a worn leather medical bag tucked behind stacks of folded towels. Once, it carried instruments and sterile gauze. Now it held different tools, an emergency vial of strong painkillers, a syringe in its packaging, and a simple outdated flip phone wrapped in a scarf. Every month, she charged it, then put it back, the same way some people maintained emergency candles they never expected to light. She managed to inject herself, the needle trembling in her left hand, the sting barely registering under the storm in her forearm. Warmth spread through her muscles, dulling the sharpest edges of agony. Her breathing slowed from frantic to controlled. She unwrapped the phone, fingers clumsy on the plastic. When she snapped the battery into place, the screen flickered, then glowed a faint green. 1 bar. Enough. She stared at the keypad. The instinct told her to dial emergency services, to ask for an ambulance. Reason cut in. The local police chief had smiled at Marcus too many times at parties. She had seen them sharing cigarettes on the balcony, and heard their low laughter in the corridor outside her door. This city had its own small ecosystem of favors and debts, and Marcus lived right in the middle of it. If she called the emergency number, there was no guarantee help would come in the form she needed. She needed someone above this small, tangled web. Someone who could not be leaned on by a mid-level official with a grudge and a drinking problem. An old sequence of numbers surfaced from the depths of her memory, unbidden but perfectly clear, like something written in ink that never fades. She had never written it down. Some numbers you didn't put in an address book or a phone's contact list. Some numbers you simply carried in your head, the way soldiers carried maps of minefields. She dialed. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. When the line clicked, the voice that answered was low, even, and as composed as she remembered. "Yes," the man said. No name, no greeting. Just a question that sounded like a command. "It's Alice," she said, her own voice breaking around the edges. "Dr. Ashworth. I need help." Silence followed. Not the confused silence of someone trying to remember, but the brief pause of a mind switching gears. Years passed between those seconds, or so it felt. When he spoke again, there was no small talk, no surprise, no reproach for the decades of no contact. "Where are you?" he asked. She gave him the address. Her hand slipped when she finished. She nearly dropped the phone. "All right," he said simply. "Don't open the door for anyone else." Then the line went dead. She lay back on the floor, cradling her arm, listening to the beat of her heart inside her own skull. The pain medication dragged at her eyelids but did not fully knock her out. Somewhere beyond the closed bedroom door, Marcus turned up the volume on the television and poured another drink, convinced he had her cornered, with nowhere to turn and no one who cared enough to interfere. He had no idea that, far above his petty domain, someone had heard the call. Returned to the dining room exactly 24 hours later, just as the second hand on the clock reached the top of its orbit. The antique clock chimed 8 times, each note resonant, clear, and sharp enough to slice through the heavy smell of food and alcohol. At the same instant, the doorbell rang. It wasn't the melodic peal they were used to, Sierra's chosen chime, sweet and unobtrusive. This sound was longer, deeper, and insistent, as if someone had leaned on the button rather than tapped it. The vibration made the glass in the china cabinet tremble softly. Marcus flinched, his shoulders jerking as though someone had tapped him on the back of the neck. Then he recovered, plastering a triumphant grin across his face. "There," he declared to the table, pushing back his chair with a scrape. "Right on time. Punctuality is the courtesy of kings. Isn't that what they say?" He shot Alice a smug look. "Our friend is here to help straighten out these little family formalities." Sierra exhaled a shaky breath, the corners of her mouth lifting in nervous relief. "Mama," she murmured, fingers tightening around her wineglass. "Please don't start anything. Just sign whatever they brought. We'll all feel better afterward, you'll see." Alice did not reply. Her gaze followed Marcus as he waddled down the corridor toward the front door, humming tunelessly, rehearsing in his head how he would speak to the notary, what jokes he would make, how casually he would mention difficult elderly relatives. The sound of the lock turning carried clearly into the dining room. Come in," Marcus boomed from the foyer. "We've been waiting. Papers ready? Let's handle this quickly. We've got a lovely dinner going." His sentence cut off like a wire had been snipped mid-current. No fading, no polite trailing away. Just a sharp, sudden stop. Silence poured into the gap. It was different from the oppressive quiet that had hung in the condo for months, the one filled with unsaid frustrations and unacknowledged bruises. This silence was dense, charged, as if all the oxygen had been pulled from the air in one massive breath. Then came the sound of footsteps. They weren't the careful, hesitant steps of an overworked notary juggling folders. These steps were heavy and synchronized, soles striking the hardwood with measured certainty. The sound moved closer, echoing down the hallway toward the dining room. Marcus's voice returned, but stripped of its earlier swagger. "Governor Sterling," he choked out, the grandness of the title colliding absurdly with the domestic setting. "What? What an honor. We weren't told. If I'd known you were coming, I'd have." "Please, sir, come in. This is a simple family matter, nothing serious, just an elderly relative." Two men appeared in the doorway first. They were tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in dark tactical clothing devoid of official patches but radiating authority with every step. Their faces were calm and alert, eyes scanning the room without curiosity. They moved like a matched pair, trained to act as one unit. Marcus backed into the dining room in front of them, walking backward, his arms half raised in a gesture that hovered between a welcome and a shield. His skin had turned the color of milk left too long on the counter, and sweat had slicked his hair against his forehead. "Everyone up," he blurted. "Stand, stand. This is the governor himself." The man who followed did not look like the fresh-faced soldier Alice remembered from a hospital bed 3 decades earlier, the one who had stared up at her with fear-filled eyes while shrapnel glittered on an X-ray like metal stars lodged in his skull. Time had widened his shoulders and carved deep lines around his mouth. His hair was now fully gray. But the way he carried himself, erect, balanced, controlled, had not changed. Neither had the steel in his gaze. He wore a tailored gray suit that didn't quite manage to make him look like a bureaucrat. On him, the fabric looked less like office wear and more like a uniform. In his hands, incongruously small against his frame, he held a bouquet of wild irises, their blue petals startlingly bright against all the gray and beige in the room. "Governor Sterling," Marcus began, stumbling forward with his hand extended, his tone sliding back toward fawning. "Allow me to." The governor walked past him. Not rudely, not shoving, just, as if Marcus weren't there at all, as though the man with the outstretched hand were a lamp or a coat-rack. Marcus's arm hung in the air, fingers slowly curling in on themselves. William Sterling's eyes were fixed on the head of the table. On Alice. He crossed the room in a few long strides, ignoring Sierra's wide-eyed stare, ignoring the frozen guests. The only sounds were the soft rustle of his suit and the quiet squeak of the floorboards under his weight. He stopped beside Alice's chair and laid the bouquet on the table in front of her empty plate, the flowers bright against the gleaming white porcelain. His gaze traveled from the untouched dish to her cast. He took in the clumsy bandaging, the bluish fingers, the way she held her body to keep from jarring the injury. The muscles along his jaw tightened until they stood out like cords. His face lost what little color it had, but his eyes, usually cold and assessing, darkened with something else entirely. Without hesitation, without a glance at anyone else in the room, the governor dropped to one knee on the hardwood floor beside her chair. The movement shocked the air out of the room. For an instant, even the clock seemed to forget to tick. He reached out and, with deliberate gentleness, covered her left hand with his own. His palm was broad and warm, the skin faintly roughened in a way that said he hadn't always spent his days at a desk. "Dr. Ashworth," he said quietly. The gleam of the tableware seemed to vibrate with the resonance of his voice. Marcus, frozen near the sideboard, made a strangled sound that could have been protest or disbelief. The 3 junior employees stared, eyes round, their forks suspended midair. "You told my people you fell," William continued, pitched low enough that the words felt intimate despite the audience. "You didn't tell them you were going without food as well." His gaze flicked pointedly from her empty plate to the scattered dishes around it, then back to her face. Embarrassment rose in her like heat at the base of her neck. To be treated like an invalid in front of the very people who had watched her be humiliated felt almost unbearable. But there was nothing condescending in the governor's expression. There was respect there, and something like grief, and a very quiet fury. He rose, moving slowly, and took in the whole table with one long look. Then he stepped toward the chair at the far end, the one Marcus had awkwardly vacated. He placed his hand on the backrest. Marcus's legs folded under him in an instant. The assistant director backed away as though the chair had sprouted spikes. His earlier bravado dissolved. He muttered something that might have been, "of course," and nearly collided with Sierra's chair in his rush to get out of the way. The governor sat. The chair seemed to accept his weight more easily than it ever had Marcus's. He unfolded the linen napkin in front of him and laid it calmly across his knees. One of the guards stepped up beside his shoulder and, with a practiced motion, set down a small roll-up pouch of polished utensils on the table, steel clean enough to reflect the light. William ignored the greasy fork and knife Marcus had abandoned, shifting them aside with the tip of his finger, a small gesture loaded with quiet disdain. He reached for the platter of duck, drawing it toward himself with no visible effort. The muscles in his forearms flexed under his jacket sleeves. He carved a slice of meat from the bird, the blade sliding smoothly through the crisp skin. His motions were measured, controlled, each stroke tidy and exact. Alice, watching, was reminded of her own hands guiding a scalpel along a sutured line. He cut the meat into small pieces, neat and uniform. He added an apple, a spoonful of vegetables, arranging them into manageable mouthfuls. Then he picked up a fork, speared a piece of duck, and turned back to Alice. There was no pity in his eyes, no apology for the audience. Only a kind of reverent concentration, as if the act he was about to perform mattered as much as any official duty of his office. "May I?" he asked. Alice's cheeks warmed, but she nodded. To refuse would have been to pretend a strength she didn't have at that moment. He brought the fork to her lips, waiting for her to accept the food, then repeated the gesture patiently, unhurried, until the sharpest edge of her hunger eased and her hands stopped shaking. Each bite carried not just taste, but a small, quiet piece of her dignity being returned. When he finally set the fork down, the room remained so hushed that the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen became noticeable. William placed his hands carefully on the table, then spoke, still facing forward. "I would like to know," he said, his tone as conversational as if they were discussing the weather, "who decided that Dr. Ashworth needed a lesson?" The words fell into the silence like a stone into still water. Ripples moved through the room. Someone swallowed audibly. A chair creaked. Sierra's hand tightened around her wineglass until the stem gave a tiny crack. Marcus laughed. It was a horrible, weak sound, more a rush of breath than a genuine chuckle. "Governor, really now," he said, trying and failing to pull his shoulders back. "Let's not make this into something it's not. Families raise their voices, things get misunderstood, you know how it is. My mother-in-law tripped. That's all. There are stairs in the building. She lost her balance. She's elderly, fragile. We were terrified." He gestured with open hands, the very picture of the concerned relative. "We look after her," he added quickly. "We dote on her. But you know how old people get. Confused." She insisted there was no need for an ambulance. "We wanted to call. We're devoted." Alice had finished swallowing the last bite of duck. She set her good hand carefully on the table, fingers resting on the linen. The pain in her arm pulsed in time with the clock's ticking, but her mind felt oddly calm now, like a theater after the curtain has been raised and the actors have stepped into their roles. "Marcus," she said, turning her head to look directly at him. He gave her a quick, sharp glance, his eyes warning her to keep quiet. "Yes, Mama?" he asked through clenched teeth, trying to maintain a mask of tenderness. "Do you want more water? The governor is busy. Don't bother him." "There are no stairs in this apartment," Alice said, each word shaped with precision. "Not one step. Even the door thresholds are flat. We had them removed after my hip surgery, remember? You signed the contractor's invoice yourself." The quiet that followed was different from every silence that had come before. The junior staffer's fork slipped from his fingers and clinked against his plate. The woman's eyes flew to the floor. Sierra's hand loosened around the stem of her glass so suddenly that it wobbled on the table. Marcus's face went blank for a heartbeat. Then the fragile facade of his story crumbled like plaster under pressure. He opened his mouth, but nothing coherent came out. His own home, his supposed asset, betrayed his lie. The governor lifted a glass of water, turning it in his fingers. He seemed to be looking at the play of light across its surface, but his attention had shifted. "No stairs," he repeated quietly. Marcus scrambled for footing in his narrative. "I meant, in the building," he stammered. "On the landing. I mixed it up. Stress, sir. We were all in shock. You know how it is when you care for someone unstable, you get flustered. William set the glass down and rose from his chair in one fluid motion. He walked toward Marcus until the smaller man found the hard surface of the china cabinet pressing into his back. The governor's shadow fell over his face. Up close, the difference in height and presence was impossible to ignore. Lying to a public official while they are carrying out their duty is a minor offense, William said softly. Lying to investigators is a serious one. He paused for a single, heavy breath. Lying to the surgeon who pulled shrapnel out of your brain and gave you back 30 years of life. His tone lowered into something colder. That is not something I'm equipped to forgive. He turned away from Marcus and looked at Alice again. She met his eyes and gave the smallest nod. It was time. Sierra, she said without raising her voice. Bring me my bag. Part 4 opened with the quiet rustle of leather and paper, not with shouting. Sierra, who had folded in on herself during the confrontation, jerked at the sound of her name. Why? She asked, her voice cracking. Mama, why do you need it now? Because we are done with stories, Alice answered evenly. Bring the bag from the hall closet. You know which one. The one you saw this morning and chose not to open. Every word landed on Sierra like a tap on glass, testing for cracks. The younger woman went pale. For a moment she looked at her husband, searching for guidance, but Marcus's eyes were locked on the floor, his mind clearly churning too fast to offer anyone else a way out. Do what your mother asked, William said, handing her the old bag he had carried in. His voice left no room for delay. Sierra took it with nervous fingers, unbuckled the clasp, and groped inside. When her hand emerged, it held a thick yellow envelope made of stiff paper, its corners creased with age. She stared at it as though it might burn her fingers, then set it gingerly on the table. Marcus tried to reclaim control, grabbing for his old tone of authority. What is that? He demanded, performing outrage as if he were the one wronged. A letter from a psychiatric clinic? Some private note about her condition? Give it here, we don't need to burden the governor with family paperwork. William took the envelope before he could touch it. He slid a hand inside and withdrew a sheet of translucent film, holding it up toward the light. The crystal chandelier above them caught the room's warmth and threw it through the film, illuminating the pale white outline of bones suspended in smoky gray. The fracture stood out clearly, a jagged line along the midsection of the radius, a clean break not near the wrist, but further up the forearm. To those who knew what they were looking at, it was as telling as a witness statement. There you go, Marcus blurted, grasping at the only bit of truth left in his story. She fell like I said. It's obvious. Elderly bones, a stumble, a fall. Anyone can see that. Poor thing. We were terrified. I served 2 tours in a war zone, the governor said, not raising his voice. His gaze remained on the film, his thumb brushing once over the dark line of the fracture. I watched men fall from transport trucks, from ladders, from roofs. I saw arms break when hands shot out to catch them. His finger tapped gently near the wrist area that remained intact. Those fractures look different. He lowered the film slowly. When his eyes met Marcus's, the room seemed to contract, all edges narrowing to the space between those 2 men. This, he went on, tapping the middle of the bone where the break was, is a defensive fracture. It happens when a person lifts their arm to protect their head from a blow coming from above. A pipe. A stick. A fist. The last word dropped like a gavel. Marcus flinched, his head snapping back as though the governor had struck him physically. He opened his mouth again, but any words he might have formed tangled somewhere in his throat and died. She didn't fall, William said, dropping the X-ray onto the table. The slick film slid across the linen and landed edge-first in a bowl of untouched salad. She was shielding herself. The guard at his side straightened slightly, the air around him sharpening. William turned his head just enough that he could see the man at the corner of his vision. Call the district attorney, he said. I want every contract and account associated with the assistant director of housing examined. 5 years back. Minimum. Check this building's basement first. Yes, sir, the major answered. He withdrew a radio from his jacket and stepped into the hallway. His tone clipped and efficient as he relayed the order. The words basement and accounts seemed to hit Marcus harder than the diagnosis of the fracture had. His eyes widened. Panic stripped away what little composure he had left. You can't do that, he shouted suddenly, voice cracking. You have no right. This is my home. You can't just walk in here and turn my life upside down because some old woman decided to slander me. He slammed his fist onto the table. Plates jumped. A glass toppled and rolled, spilling wine across the cloth like dark arterial spreading under a wound. I'm the owner here, he shouted. I pay the bills. I keep everyone in this house fed, including her. He jabbed a finger toward Alice. She's nothing without me. Do you hear me? She's. His rant cut off as abruptly as his greeting by the front door had. He had lunged forward, perhaps intending to reach Alice again, perhaps just needing someone to blame. But William rose as he moved, straightening to his full height, and stepped between them. He didn't shove or threaten. He simply existed in Marcus's path like a wall that had always been there. Marcus stopped. Not because he wanted to, but because every instinct in him recognized the boundary he could not cross. Sit, the governor said. There was no heat in the word. There didn't need to be. It carried the same quality as a command given on a battlefield, a single syllable layered with authority, habit, and expectation. Marcus's knees buckled. He slid down the side of the cabinet and ended up back on the floor, this time with no theatrical groveling, just raw, shaky breathing. You claimed this place is yours, Alice said, now that the physical threat had receded. You shouted about your rights. You broke my arm for a real estate deed you were desperate to secure. She reached for the cardboard folder lying beside the X-ray and nudged it open with her left hand. Inside lay a single sheet of official paper, its watermark faint but visible. When my husband died, I had decisions to make, she continued, her eyes never leaving Marcus's face. About legacy, about what this apartment meant, about what would become of it when I no longer needed walls and a ceiling. She turned the document so he could read the header printed in formal, black letters. 10 years ago, I gave this condo to the hospital's charitable foundation. In exchange, I kept one thing only, the right to live here until I die. The words settled on Marcus like dust on something forgotten. For a moment, he stared without comprehension. Then understanding hit. It didn't land like a single blow. It seeped into him slowly, poisoning his last fragile hopes. The paper he had planned to force her to sign, the deed he had thought would save his skin, had always been meaningless. You beat me over a home that was never yours to sell, Alice said softly. You starved me for the value of something that already belongs to the city. You've been bullying a woman in a place that belongs to the hospital where she worked for 3 decades, protected solely by a clause and a signature you never bothered to check. A low, animal sound escaped him. It wasn't a word. It wasn't even quite a sob. It was the noise of something breaking, somewhere deep inside his chest. He slid forward on the floor, half crawling, hands scrambling for purchase on the polished wood. He reached her chair and grabbed at the legs, his fingers leaving damp marks where sweat and tears mixed. Dr. Ashworth, he rasped. Then, Mama. The word tasted strange in his mouth, suddenly, as if he were trying it on for the first time. I didn't know. How could I have known? I was desperate. They'll kill me if I don't pay them. You have to understand. You're the only one who can. Ask the governor to go easy on me. He listens to you. You saved his life. Please. I'll do anything. He tried to clutch at the hem of her dress, but she pulled her feet back, the movement slow, controlled, deliberate. Sierra, watching her husband collapse, began to unravel herself. She stood abruptly enough to tip her chair, then dropped to her knees beside him, shoving his shoulder, trying to edge closer. Don't listen to him, Sierra cried, grasping for her mother's good arm with shaking hands. He forced me into everything, Mama. I was scared. He said if I didn't stand by him, he'd ruin us both. You can't imagine what he's like when he's alone with me. I wanted to call an ambulance last night. I swear I did. He ripped out the phone line. He threatened me. Alice listened. She watched the two of them fight to be nearer to her, not out of love, but out of survival. The husband who had broken her arm. The daughter who had watched and done nothing. She waited for the familiar ache that talk of her child usually stirred, for the maternal instinct that had guided so many of her decisions throughout her life. Nothing came. Sierra, she said quietly. Her daughter straightened, hope flickering on her face. Yes, Mama, she whispered quickly. I knew you'd understand. I love you. You know I love you. Tell the governor it was all Marcus. Tell him I'm a victim too. Please. You told me to be quiet, Alice answered. Last night. Lying there on the floor, with my arm shaped wrong and my head ringing. I remember exactly what you said. You leaned over me and whispered that I should be quiet or the neighbors would hear. You were worried my noise would embarrass you. Sierra flinched. Her hands fell away from her mother's arm. Mascara had smeared down her cheeks, but there were no fresh tears now. All the excuses she'd been ready to offer turned to dust. You weren't afraid of me, Alice went on, each word as measured as a clean incision. You were afraid of a scandal that might cling to his career, to your comfort. You chose that over my safety, over my pain. That was your choice. In the corner, the Major's phone chimed with a short message tone. He checked the screen, then stepped forward, murmuring something into the governor's ear. William listened, eyes narrowing slightly. When the officer withdrew, the governor picked up his own phone and glanced down. A tiny twitch at the corner of his mouth might, in another situation, have been mistaken for amusement. Here, it looked more like grim satisfaction. My people move fast, he said blandly, sliding the device back into his pocket. The basement in this building is interesting. Assistant Director. On paper, it contains mops and spare paint. In reality, it appears to hold enough smuggled goods to stock several small stores. Liquor. Cigarettes. Boxes whose labels we'll have to examine more closely. Marcus stopped moaning. He stared, horrified, as if someone had opened a trapdoor beneath him and he could see the depth of the fall. It was temporary, he blurted. Just storage, nothing more. Everyone does it. Everyone looks the other way. You chose the basement of the building where this woman lives, William replied. Where the neurosurgeon who risked her career to operate on a young sergeant with shrapnel in his head comes home at night. And then you broke her arm inside the same walls. He didn't have to say anything else. A nod to the Major was enough. Two guards moved forward with abrupt, practiced efficiency. Marcus's pleas turned into high-pitched babble as they pulled him to his feet, twisted his arms behind his back, and marched him toward the hall. He jerked and struggled, but not for long. Years behind a desk had left him soft. They were strong and unyielding. Please, Marcus howled, slipping out of his shoes, his socks sliding across the floor. Sierra, do something. Tell him we're family. Tell him we can work it out between us. Mama, I didn't mean. The hallway swallowed his words. The heavy front door closed with a deep, solid thud. It sounded like the end of a long, grueling operation when the last clamp was removed and the last instrument counted. The condo did not instantly become a place of peace. The walls were the same. The furniture stayed where it was. But the air felt different, as though someone had opened a window in a smoky room. William's assistants moved quickly, clearing away plates smeared with grease, the half-eaten duck, the overturned wineglass. They opened the actual windows, and cool night air drifted in from the street, diluting the lingering odor of alcohol and heavy food. Sierra remained standing for a moment, as if deciding whether to run after her husband or cling to the table. Then, under the weight of both exhaustion and something else less defined, she sank back into a chair, shoulders curved in on themselves. The 3 junior staffers from Marcus's office lingered near the far end of the table, stiff and awkward, their eyes down. They knew instinctively that what they had just seen was something they would never mention, not at work, not at home. Soon, one of the governor's people ushered the guests out as politely as the situation allowed. There was talk of cars waiting downstairs, of statements that might be required later. Doors opened and closed. Coats were collected. Apologies were offered to Alice, soft murmurs of "we didn't know" and "I'm so sorry," that she acknowledged with a slight incline of her head and nothing more. She had no energy left to sort genuine regret from self-preservation. Eventually, it was only Alice and William at the table. Someone had placed a porcelain teapot on the table between them, the thin steam rising in slow curls. 2 cups stood ready, each with a slice of lemon resting in a saucer. The red folder with the deed lay closed near Alice's left elbow. The X-ray, wiped clean of salad dressing, leaned against a breadbasket, the fracture lines still visible in the lamplight. Her arm throbbed steadily inside the cast. The pain had shifted from the sharp stab of immediate injury to the dull, constant ache of a bone that knew it would heal, but had not forgotten the exact way it had broken. She could live with that ache. She understood it. It had meaning. William poured tea into both cups, his hands as steady as they had been while cutting the duck earlier. "Is there anything you need?" he asked, sounding less like a governor and more like a former patient sitting across from the doctor who had once spoken to him in a bright operating theater. "I can arrange full-time care, if you'd like. A safer place to stay for a while. A private room at the regional hospital. Security posted outside your door. Medication. Paperwork. You only have to ask." Alice smiled faintly, the expression small but sincere. "All my life," she said, looking at the slice of lemon as it floated in her tea, "I made decisions for other people in crises. I told families what we could do, what we couldn't, which parts of the brain would never wake up, which functions might be retrained. Tonight I needed someone to act for me, just once. You did that. I thank you." He shook his head slightly. "You saved my life," he replied simply. "You did it under worse conditions than this. What I did tonight was procedure. Paper and signatures. Paper and signatures can be very sharp tools in unsteady hands," she said. "Just like scalpels." She looked at him more directly. "There is one thing I need, though." William straightened. His expression shifted, becoming attentive in that particular way powerful people have when they are ready to grant favors most others can't. "Tell me," he said. Alice's gaze moved to the center of the cleared table. Amid the removed dishes, one small plate remained. On it sat a slice of chocolate cake, its layers stark under the softened lights, its frosting smooth and dark. A dessert that had been meant for the end of a celebration that never properly began. "Bring me the fork," she said. For a moment, the governor blinked, almost thrown off balance by the simplicity of the request. "The fork," he repeated. "Yes," Alice answered. "Slide it closer to me." He reached out and gently moved the dessert plate so that it rested directly in front of her, the small silver fork glinting in the light. He hesitated, as if wondering whether he should offer to feed her again. His eyes flicked unconsciously to the cast, to the way it pinned her right arm uselessly in her lap. Alice's left hand rose slowly. It trembled slightly, less from age than from the remnants of adrenaline still coursing through her body. She wrapped her fingers around the fork's handle. It felt awkward, wrong, her muscles protesting the unfamiliar task. All her life, her right hand had done the delicate work of cutting and stitching. Her left had been supported. Tonight, that arrangement had to change. "Marcus told everyone I couldn't even hold one," she said quietly, lowering her eyes to the shining metal. "That without his generosity, I'd starve in front of a full table. That I was, essentially, already useless." Her mouth tightened for a fraction of a second. "I can't let that be the story I remember when I think of this day." She lifted the fork and clumsily cut a piece of cake. The layers crumbled a bit under the unfamiliar angle, but she persisted, guiding the bite to her mouth. Frosting touched her tongue, rich and sweet. The sugar hit her system with a rush of warmth that spread outward from her chest, down into her stomach, up toward her throat. It wasn't the best cake she'd ever eaten. The sponge was a little dry. The frosting is a little too sugary. But it might have been the most important. I am not helpless, she said aloud, as if she needed to hear the words in her own voice. I am not a burden someone graciously puts up with. She took another bite, the fork a little steadier this time. I was a surgeon. I still am, inside. Today I didn't open someone's skull, but I let go of something that had been poisoning my life for years. The clock ticked from its corner, measuring out seconds that finally felt like they belonged to her again. Tick. Another bite. Tock. Another breath that didn't taste like fear. Sometimes, Alice murmured, gazing past William's shoulder at the city lights winking through the window, the only way to save the whole is to remove a part. A limb that will infect the whole body if you keep it. A growth that doesn't stop on its own. She set the fork down carefully, her left hand hovering above it for a moment. I loved my daughter, she said. I would have loved my son-in-law if he had given me any chance to. But love is not a free pass to destroy someone. William nodded once, his jaw set. What happens now, he said, will follow the law. There will be investigations. Hearings. You will be kept informed. You will not be left alone with the consequences. She smiled, a little wryly. I have been alone with the consequences of other people's choices for a long time, Will. That part is not new. What is new is that I no longer have to pretend any of this is kindness. They drank their tea. The night outside thickened. Somewhere far below, car horns sounded and faded, a reminder that the city moved on, indifferent to what had just happened 4 floors up. In the hallway, the major spoke quietly into his radio, arranging transport, coordinating with officials. Sierra sat in the next room, shoulders shaking silently, faced for the first time with a version of her life where her mother was no longer something she could bend at will. Hours later, when the governor rose to leave, he rested his hand briefly on the back of Alice's chair in a gesture that echoed the way he had claimed the head of the table earlier. If you change your mind about any of my offers, he said, you know how to reach me. And if you don't, I'll make sure someone checks in on you regardless. When the door closed behind him and his staff, a new kind of quiet settled over the condo. Not the heavy, suffocating silence of intimidation, but the uncertain quiet of a house between occupants, waiting to learn what kind of life it would shelter next. The clock continued to mark time. Later still, when the plates were washed and the lights dimmed, when the bouquet of irises had been moved to a vase and set by the window, Alice sat alone at the table with her cast resting on a cushion in her lap. The fork lay beside the empty dessert plate. She picked it up once more, just to feel its weight, to remind herself that her left hand had done what she'd asked of it. Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed for reasons unrelated to her. Somewhere else, papers were being reviewed, contracts examined, accounts frozen. In the basement of the building, men in uniform catalogued boxes that had never legally existed. The life she had been forced into over the last few years was collapsing in slow motion, room by room, ledger by ledger. On a screen far away, a storyteller sat in front of a microphone, adjusting it as the recording light flicked on. My friends, the narrator's voice said, reaching listeners scattered across cities and continents. Before we begin, a small request. If this story touches something in you, if you recognize the chains Alice lived under, or the strength it took to break them, let us know. Share where you're listening from. Your words remind us how far these stories travel. The storyteller began to recount what had happened in that condo. The broken arm, the empty plate, the doorbell, the governor with a bouquet of wildflowers, the fork that an old woman finally lifted in her non-dominant hand. Listeners leaned closer to their phones and laptops, some with anger tightening their throats, others with sadness gathering behind their eyes. Many of them knew, intimately, the tension between love and survival, between loyalty and self-respect. Some would ask themselves whether Alice had gone too far when she chose law over blood. Others would decide she had waited too long. Either way, The story would stay with them precisely because it offered no soft, easy answer. Back in the quiet condo, Alice shifted in her chair and let her gaze rest on the city lights outside. Her life was not suddenly simple again. Doctors knew better than anyone that recovery is rarely quick or painless. But for the first time in a long time, she felt something like space open up inside her chest. A small, clean room where her thoughts could move without bumping up against someone else's bullying voice. She closed her eyes briefly, listening to the ticking of the clock and the echo of her own earlier words. I am not helpless. When she opened them again, the fork still rested in her hand. She smiled, tired but genuine. Whatever came next, lawyers, hearings, awkward conversations with neighbors, she would face it as the person she had been before fear and grief shoved her into the shadows. A woman who made hard choices in terrible situations, who believed that sometimes the bravest operation was the one that cut away what everyone else insisted you had to keep. Tick. The clock marked another second in her reclaimed life.